Hello and welcome to the show. Now, one of the early challenges we had in Forza 4 was to try and get a C-Class car to reach 200 miles an hour. Initially, it sounded absolutely stupid. However, on further investigations, turned out you could get pretty damn close. I had plenty of cars get up towards the 190 mile an hour mark. Things like this Dodge Daytona. The fastest we ever got was a classic Shelby Mustang that did 195. However, none of them could hit the magical 200 mile an hour mark. Admittedly, with a bit of slipstream, we did get the Daytona and a few of the other muscle cars to crack 200, but without the slipstream, couldn't get the cars to do it. And with Forza 6 having car classes very, very similar to that of 4, it seemed like a good challenge to revisit, and there's plenty of new vehicles to try out as well and see how they fare. Now, why is this challenge so difficult? Well, to get a car to be quick in a straight line, you need two things. First of all, you need good aerodynamics. It needs to be very efficient at cutting through the air. Cars like this Auto Union can get to very, very high top speed with relatively little power because they cut through the air very, very well. This one with 485 horsepower will get to 225 miles an hour. The Streamliner version of this car will go on to sort of 240, 250 miles an hour. Incredibly quick because it is very, very efficient at cutting through the air. However, you do also need power. That is the other important thing. Once you start getting up towards 180, 200 miles an hour, you've got a lot of air resistance to overcome, so you keep needing more and more power to keep accelerating. And the problem is we need to do all of this in a C-Class car. That doesn't give us very much PI to really play around with. The cars that tend to be good at cutting through the air, well, if they're low enough class, if they're below C-Class to begin with, they tend to pick up sort of rating points, PI points very, very quickly when you start putting engine parts on them, when you start giving them more power, so they very quickly get out of C-Class. And the cars that you can get a lot of power in tend to be, the big American bricks that aren't very aerodynamic at all. So it is a tough challenge to build a car for this particular thing. Now, the vehicle that I decided to start with, it seemed like a pretty sensible choice to begin with. The Lamborghini Miura, the first of the almost true supercars, mid-engine, rear-wheel drive, and I'd hoped this would be pretty good on the whole aerodynamics front. The problem with it starts off as a low C-Class car, and as soon as you start putting on engine parts, it doesn't take very long for this car to get up to the top of C-Class. The finished Miura that I have here has 450 horsepower. So it's got slightly less horsepower than the Auto Union, and it doesn't cut through the air quite as nicely as the race car, meaning its top speed 178 miles an hour. Not bad for a first attempt, certainly, but it's simply not quick enough. And the problem is cars like this Lamborghini, because they handle relatively well for what we're trying to do here, that handling essentially takes up PI points that we can't use for power, so we can't get the car powerful enough to get the 200 mile an hour mark. Although admittedly, the big plus side for the Lamborghini is at least we can drive down the straight and survive the bumps and so on without the car being chucked around, because it does have half decent suspension and tyres and so on. Now, the next car, this one was a little bit of a wild card, the Lotus 11. Now, I've proved a number of times the 11 can get to very, very high speeds with incredibly little power. The problem is trying to keep it in C-Class and do this, it doesn't quite work. Now, this car I've just done, I think I probably did gearbox, and I'll put the race gearbox in it, of course, so we can tune the gear ratios for this, and just engine upgrades. And while it starts off at, I think it's D-Class, maybe even E-Class, this car, we can only get 167 horsepower. That's all I can get in the Lotus before it tops out of C-Class. That's still enough to get it to 173 miles an hour. 173 miles an hour with 167 horsepower. Pretty damn good going from the Lotus 11. That's, 5 miles an hour slower than the Lamborghini Miura, with an awful lot less, 300 less horsepower, near enough. It's incredible how fast this car can go with such little horsepower. However, we can't give it enough power in C-Class to get to the 200 mile an hour mark. Now, traditionally the cars that did well in this were the ridiculous American cars. Now, the reason why this El Camino, for example, the reason why this is pretty good for this sort of challenge is you can get an awful lot of power. This has the NASCAR engine in it with the restrictors taken off, which means 994 horsepower in the El Camino. And yes, it does not have very good aerodynamics at all. It kind of doesn't matter because it has so much brute force that we're hoping that it would be enough to get it to 200 miles an hour. The problem is, these old cars don't really have the handling to deal with this much power. Again, trying to keep this car in C-Class, you are very, very limited to what you can do. You can't put race tyres on the car. You can't put weight reduction on the car. And the problem is with these tyres and this sort of speed and suspension that we're trying to ask the vehicle to deal with, it just can't do it. And the inevitable happened with the El Camino. I lost it and spun. Although it did get up to 193 miles an hour before I inevitably binned it in a wall. Now, there are some things that we can do to try and help with this handling problem. The Ford Country Boat, for example, again, the maxed out NASCAR engine, so 994 horsepower in this one. I tried sticking race suspension and aero on the vehicle. Now, the aero is a slightly strange choice, you may be thinking, because the aero adds drag, which is terrible. We don't want to be adding drag really to our vehicles. The hope was, though, that the drag wasn't going to be so much that it would stop it to getting to 200 miles an hour, and it might add a little bit of control. But this wasn't enough. I tried this with the El Camino as well. It wasn't enough to do anything about the handling problems. The car was simply too difficult to drive. The Ford got to 183, and even then we were really fighting the car. You can see it moving around. Simply the tyres aren't good enough to deal with these speeds. No amount of race suspension and aero can stop the car from letting go, as it's kind of wiggling its way down the road. I mean, we're 180 odd miles an hour here, and you just no control of the Country Boat. It's gone. Yeah, this was a little bit of a problem. I had slightly high hopes that these vehicles might be able to survive it, but they simply couldn't. Now, this next one was a curious one. The Ford Transit. Yes, it is all the aerodynamical properties of a barn. However, this was the first vehicle that the benchmark reckoned could hit 200 miles an hour. It again has the NASCAR engine. However, I couldn't take the restrictors off it and keep it in C-Class. So it has 825 horsepower as opposed to nearly 1,000. This was a strange one. I'm hazarding a guess, because this is a more modern vehicle. We have slightly more modern tyres. We've got more modern suspension on this than the likes of the El Camino and the Country Boat. Despite the terrible aerodynamics, it reckoned it could hit the 200 miles an hour mark. I really wanted the Transit to be able to. It was so close I couldn't put the aero parts on the car, or on the van I should say, and I'm pretty sure the rear aero jumped it well out of C-Class, so I was restricted pretty much to engine and suspension. That was it. I didn't even have the race gearbox in this vehicle. With the standard transmission that comes with the NASCAR engine, it reckoned the van could hit 200 miles an hour. It got bloody close, but the problem is it still couldn't quite deal with the Le Mans straight. The problem is it is slightly bumpy, as we saw coming into the kink at the end of the straight here. It is slightly bumpy, and when you have an almost standard sort of van handling wise, trying to deal with the bumps down here, the tyres do not have the grip, and I can't upgrade the tyres because then we'll be well into B class. So yeah, it was so close. It was tantalizingly close. I tried tinkering around with the suspension setup as much as I could, and I could not get it to deal with the bumps well enough. The problem is you hit the bumps at 190 in a Transit. It's not designed for dealing with 190 mile an hour bumps. I very nearly rolled the van through there. Amazingly, I was running simulation damage at this point, and the van never took any actual damage. I mean, we cracked the windscreen and damaged the bumpers and so on. Never took any actual damage. Pretty sturdy car, this one, despite a couple of hefty whacks on the wall. I tried my best. I really wanted the Transit to get 200 miles an hour just for the silliness. Admittedly, 190 odd miles an hour is pretty ridiculous in a Transit, but we could not quite crack the 200 mile an hour mark. 195 was the best that I could get it. I'm sure if it could get it under control, it could actually hit 200, but it was so difficult to keep it there. When we hit 195 just before the corner, it's you're fighting it so much that there are times when you have to let off the throttle, or you have to sort of be adjusting the steering, fighting the thing for control. Yeah, it was close. The Transit was mighty close, and I didn't expect it to necessarily be that close, but it couldn't do it either. Now, our most powerful vehicle here is the Ford Deluxe Coupe. Now, this is an interesting one. We get the engine from the Ferrari Enzo in here. The V12, 1,182, so near enough 1,200 horsepower in this. In a car with 1940s tyres, you can imagine the difficulties that you get from this. I did have the race suspension, I did have the PI to put the race suspension on it. Don't have the PI to put the aero on. I think it adds about 45 PI trying to put the rear aero on. I kind of wanted the aero just for a hope of getting this vehicle under control. There's more than enough power to overcome the drag. The problem is there is not enough grip from the tyres. It simply will not hold onto the road, and it doesn't matter what you do with the car, what you do with the gearbox. At 180 miles an hour plus, you cannot get this car to put any more power down. So you just see, I mean, it's just spent the entire way for that part of the straight spinning the wheels. No matter what I did with the throttle, no matter what I did with any of it, you could not get the car to stop spinning wheels. It simply did not have the grip. Incredibly fast, huge amount of power in this car, but it cannot use it. You see here, we see the telemetry up. Once we got past 180 miles an hour, it's okay for now, and then we start spinning the wheels. And I'm trying frantically to find a point where we can just get enough power down to get it just over that 200 mile an hour mark. I only needed to hit it very, very briefly. I got 198 out of the Ford Deluxe, and then the wheels start spinning again. Then you have to back off the throttle, and then you go again, and it cannot quite do it. This is another one, so annoyingly, tantalizingly close with the Deluxe, but I couldn't get it. The tyres just give up, and that's not surprising, let's face it. But yeah, I couldn't do it. And then we have a huge slide and promptly lose it with the with the Ford. Go for a big rotation. I tried to get it back under control, wasn't happening. May have bumped a wall and broken things, but again, another car, very, very close. Couldn't quite do it. So the silly vehicles weren't working out. They had the power, and they technically could, in theory, get to 200 miles an hour. The problem is we lacked the control. And on this Le Mans straight, while yes, it is the longest straight that we've got available to us in Forza, the little bumps and the slight kinks and so on caused them cars no end of problems. So I had to go back to something a little bit more sensible. Was rummaging through the various cars option, decided the Mercedes, the Gullwing, would be a potentially good choice. You saw it coming around the corner onto the straight. The suspension still quite interesting in this car. Still leans a lot at the high-speed stuff, but it's good enough to deal with the bumps down the straight. The wheels aren't constantly spinning down the straights. This one had the 3.2-litre inline-6, I think the BMW M3 engine in this, modified up to 549 horsepower. So decent amount of power in this car. The tyres, the suspension, much better suited. However, we didn't quite have the power to get to the mark 197 miles an hour in the Gullwing. Much more controlled than the Ford Deluxe and the Transit and so on, but yeah, it still couldn't quite do the 200 mile an hour mark. It was very, very close. Again, this car, with a much longer straight, the benchmark reckoned it could, but at Le Mans it just ran out of steam basically, and yeah, we didn't quite have the long enough straight for that car to do it. So I had to, yeah, I thought I was in a little bit of trouble. Had to get a little bit more creative. It came to the sensible kind of muscle cars. Now, I wasn't sure that these were going to work. The reason being is that the sensible, or more sensible muscle cars, and the likes of the El Camino and so on, wouldn't be able to have the NASCAR engine. You couldn't put that into these because it would jump them well out of C-Class. So we had to be using the standard engine, and of course, to keep them in the C-Class, we couldn't just simply max them out. We had to pick and choose the upgrade parts and so on. The Daytona, this one was twin turbocharged, had 678 horsepower in it, and this standard a pretty good chance of getting to the 200 miles an hour. It took so long to pick up speed further down the straight. We were at 195, 6, gradually going. Eventually, just before we reached the corner, it clicked over to 200 miles an hour. The Daytona did it. It cracked the 200 mile an hour mark. Admittedly, it did kind of do a wheelie around the kink at the end of the straight, which is a little bit scary. However, the Daytona was the first car to crack 200 miles an hour in C-Class. And then the speeds kept getting quicker and quicker. With these muscle cars, it turns out they had enough grip to be able to deal with the 200 mile an hour speeds, and you get lots and lots of power in them in C-Class. This Firebird that went up, standard engine, 850 horsepower, 861 foot-pounds of torque, massively powerful engine. in this car. Admittedly, you know, we're not as aerodynamic as the likes of the Daytona, but a huge amount of power in this car. That was good for 204 miles an hour. That's a lot of straight line speed in this car, and various other ones as well would do similar things. I built the AMC Rebel Machine one. That would get past the 200 mile an hour mark. These cars had enough handling to be able to, you know, stay in a straight line down here, and you could still get enough power in them and keep them in C-Class to do this. Still quite scary cars to drive, don't get me wrong. These were not easy to drive, and certainly the king at the end of the straight, this was always an interesting thing. You know, we're talking about 200 miles an hour, you're throwing the cars in here with no rear grip. Massively sideways moments for the Firebird. 204 miles an hour, I was really impressed with that. I thought that was a really, really good speed. And then it all paled into insignificance because of the Mazda RX3. This car, well, it starts off very, very low PI. I didn't really think about this vehicle. I wanted to try a car with a quad rotor, and I was trying the Mazda Cosmos, and that didn't work. Turns out you can put a quad rotor in the RX3 and it will stay in C-Class, which means we've got 800 horsepower, a very, very noisy rotary, and the car, it just accelerates quicker than anything else we've had here. It's doing 200 before we get halfway down the straight, and still it's picking up speed. And this is the unrestricted quad rotor. Taking the restrictors off made no difference to the PI. That's how bad it reckons this car is going to drive, up to 215 miles an hour down here. It doesn't really have the grip from the tyres. You can see the tyres are not happy about me doing this particularly, and you are fighting the car a little bit. It's wiggling around, but if you can get it long enough, pointing in a straight line, 220 miles an hour from the RX3, still in C-Class, and then it lets go around the fast corner, as you might expect. Poses for the camera, and we've got it back under control without bumping into a wall, which I was quite pleased with as well. The RX3 is absurd. The fact that it can do 220 in C-Class, yes, it doesn't drive very well at all, really, but yeah, it can stay on the road just about at speeds over 200 miles. I mean, that's only 5 miles an hour lower than the Auto Union. That's really quite impressive from the RX3. Yeah, it stays on the road at, 30 miles an hour quicker than the likes of the Ford Country Boat and so on could deal with. They just lost control at 180, whereas this would just about. It was very much on the limit of control down there. I wouldn't want any less grip at all available, because that was just on the limit at those speeds. But it did it, and we have some celebratory noisy donuts from the Mazda. Yeah, I didn't expect to get that higher a speed. I never thought we'd get 220. I thought we may get, you know, just about the 200 mile an hour mark. I was quite pleased with the Firebird getting 204. I thought that was really rather impressive. But no, the Mazda RX3 well and truly mullers the competition with that 220 mile an hour run. Anyway, that is it for this video, guys. A very interesting challenge, trying to build cars for this particular sort of thing. Thank you very much for watching, and until next time, goodbye.